Did Tony Stark walk into his final moment without fear because he already knew how the entire multiverse story would end, including his own death? I started asking myself this when I rewatched Endgame and noticed something unsettling about Tony's behavior, his silence, his calm eyes, and the way he never once hesitates when the universe is literally at stake. It feels less like a man making a desperate gamble and more like someone following a script he has already read to the very last page. And that realization changes everything we think we know about Iron Man. Tonight, I want to break down a theory that reframes Tony Stark not as a victim of fate, but as its most informed architect. A theory that suggests he saw the ending coming long before we ever did. And he chose to walk straight toward it with absolute certainty and no regret. After Thanos snapped his fingers, the world didn't just lose half its population, it lost its direction, its heroes, and its sense of narrative closure. And during those 5 silent years, everyone assumes Tony Stark retired into domestic peace. I don't think that's true, because Tony has never been someone who stops thinking, especially when the universe has just proven that it can be mathematically conquered. Living with Pepper and raising Morgan didn't turn his mind off. It sharpened it, giving him something worth protecting and a reason to understand every possible future where that protection fails. While the rest of the Avengers were broken, grieving, or hiding, Tony was doing what he always does when reality scares him. He was running simulations. Not just battle strategies, but timelines, outcomes, branching possibilities, and sacrificial endpoints. The blip gave him something he never had before. Uninterrupted time to stare into the abyss and map it. I believe those 5 years are when Tony Stark quietly learned everything. Not emotionally, not spiritually, but scientifically, obsessively, and completely. He wasn't waiting for hope. He was preparing for inevitability. And inevitability always leaves a trail. Tony followed it all the way forward, further than anyone else dared, because fear never stopped his curiosity once. Time travel in Endgame is often treated like a sudden miracle, but I think Tony Stark understood time long before he solved the equation that everyone else celebrates. Tony knew Doctor Strange didn't hand over the Time Stone out of fear, panic, or weakness, and that detail matters more than any punch thrown in Infinity War. Strange saw millions of futures, but he chose only one. And Tony would never accept that number without asking why the others failed. When Smart Hulk spoke to the Ancient One, and she explained that time isn't a straight line but a branching structure, Tony wasn't shocked. He was validated. That single explanation reframed everything, because if timelines can split, then outcomes can be predicted, ranked, and optimized. I think Tony spent years simulating which branches survive, which collapse, and which demand a price only he could pay. This wasn't mysticism. It was probability weaponized by genius. Time became just another system Tony could stress test. And the more he tested it, the clearer one outcome became. There was only one timeline where everyone else lived. And in that timeline, Tony Stark did not. He accepted that conclusion without drama. Because logic rarely begs for mercy. It simply demands obedience. Tony listened carefully always. People love to point at the kitchen scene, the hologram of Peter Parker, and claim that emotion magically unlocked time travel. But that reading has always felt dishonest to me. Tony Stark doesn't stumble into breakthroughs. He circles them for years, waiting for the moment they're safe to release. The photo wasn't a solution, it was permission. Permission to finally act on something he already understood but refused to touch. For 5 years, Tony avoided reopening the wound of time, because once you change it, you invite consequences that don't care about your intentions. The kitchen moment brought Peter back into focus, not as a lost child, but as proof that the future Tony saw was still worth building. I think the equation was already solved in fragments, incomplete because Tony didn't yet accept the cost attached to it. Seeing Peter didn't give him knowledge, it gave him resolve. And once Tony commits, he moves with terrifying clarity. There's no hesitation in his hands when he builds the GPS. Because he isn't discovering the path, he's reopening one he already mapped. The photo just unlocked the door. And Tony walked through without looking back. He knew where it led. And he accepted the destination. Long before the audience did too. Tony's understanding of time also explains something quieter. Something most viewers overlook, the strange calm between him and Steve Rogers at the end. By then, Tony knows exactly what Steve is going to do, and more importantly, why he has to do it alone. Returning the stones isn't just cleanup, it's maintenance of the branching system Tony has already charted. He understands that Steve will choose an alternate life, not out of selfishness, but because that choice stabilizes a fragile timeline. I don't think Tony ever intended to stop him, because Steve's happiness is part of the equation that allows the rest of the universe to keep breathing. That's why there's no dramatic argument, no last-minute speech, just a look that says they both finally understand each other. Tony already ran the simulation where he stops Steve, and it fails. He ran the one where Steve stays, and that fails too. The only version that works is the one where they let go. So Tony chooses silence instead of control. It's respect, not resignation. Two soldiers recognizing the end of their war and accepting different victories. Tony wins by ending the fight. Steve wins by finally living. Both outcomes were already seen. Tony just didn't say it aloud ever. Here's where the theory gets darker, because Thanos was never the endgame, he was the catalyst that cracked the multiverse open. Tony Stark would understand immediately that time manipulation invites bigger predators. Beings who don't just conquer worlds, but rewrite them. In every simulation where the Avengers win, something else wakes up, something watching from beyond linear reality. I think Tony saw that threat coming. Not as a face yet, but as a shadow forming behind every successful future. That shadow eventually has a name, Dr. Doom. A mind that blends science and magic with terrifying efficiency. Tony knows he can't be the one to stop that kind of enemy because Doom doesn't play by rules Tony can fully control. But Tony also sees something else. That Doom's rise requires Tony's absence. As long as Iron Man exists, the multiverse remains unstable. Too many variables orbit him, too many branches collapse around his survival. I think Tony realized the safest future was one where he becomes a fixed point. Not alive, not evolving, but resolved. That's how you protect a system from corruption, by removing the unpredictable constant. And Tony Stark was that constant. He always knew it. That knowledge changes sacrifice into strategy, not tragedy. That matters later immensely. Watch Tony in Endgame's final battle and notice how different he feels compared to every other time he faced death. There's no panic, no scrambling for alternatives, no hope that someone else will swoop in at the last second. Tony moves like a man reaching the final step of a plan he finished writing years ago. When the stones slide into his armor, there's recognition in his eyes, not surprise. I don't see a desperate hero, I see a scientist confirming a hypothesis. Tony knows the snap will kill him, and he also knows every other option leads to something worse. That's why he doesn't deliver a speech, doesn't look for approval, doesn't hesitate. He says exactly what needs to be said, nothing more. I am Iron Man isn't bravado, it's closure. It's the signature at the bottom of a calculation. Tony isn't scared because fear disappears when uncertainty is gone. He already accepted this outcome in a quieter room years earlier. The battlefield is just where the math completes. And for Tony Stark, math is truth. He trades his life for stability, and he does it without regret. Because regret belongs to uncertainty. Tony left uncertainty behind. Years before the snap, when he first saw the ending clearly alone. Tony's death doesn't feel like an ending because the story immediately keeps moving, as if the universe anticipated his absence. I think that's intentional, because Tony didn't just save the world, he prepared it. Doctor Strange, Peter Parker, and eventually minds like Reed Richards are positioned to handle what comes next. Tony knew he couldn't be present for the next war without becoming the reason it starts. So he leaves behind knowledge, not instructions, allowing the future to adapt rather than follow orders. That's the difference between control and wisdom, and Tony finally chooses the latter. His technology doesn't dominate the future. It supports it from the shadows. Even Edith represents trust, a system designed to be used by someone else. I think Tony understood that heroes must eventually step aside. Otherwise, they become gods, and gods invite rebellion. The multiverse needs evolution, not permanence. Tony ensures that by becoming a legend instead of a ruler. Legends inspire, they don't interfere. And inspiration is harder to corrupt. I believe that was Tony's final safeguard. Remove himself. Elevate everyone else, and trust the system to grow. That's not weakness, it's foresight. The kind only Stark possessed. He planned beyond his lifetime, and the universe survived because of it, exactly as intended. When Secret Wars finally unfolds, I think the echoes of Tony Stark will be everywhere, even if his name is never spoken. The rules of the conflict, the balance of power, and the sacrifices demanded will all trace back to decisions he already made. Dr. Doom thrives in a universe shaped by absence, where gods are dead and mortals inherit the burden. Tony created that universe deliberately, not to empower Doom, but to make him defeatable. A living Iron Man would be an obstacle Doom could exploit or absorb. A dead one becomes an unchangeable constant Doom must work around. I think Tony saw that the only way to win the next war was to not be in it. That's a brutal realization, but Tony Stark has always been brutally honest with himself. He doesn't romanticize survival, he optimizes outcomes. In Secret Wars, heroes will fight for reality itself, and they'll be standing on a foundation Tony laid. Every rule, every limit, every sacrifice echoes his math. He didn't stop the story, he structured it. That's a godlike act without arrogance. And that's why Doom matters. He is the test Tony prepared for, the final confirmation of Stark's theory. That sacrifice beats domination. Every time. Across every universe forever unchanged. When I connect all these dots, the picture that forms isn't tragic, it's terrifyingly precise. Tony Stark didn't die because he was outmatched, he died because the math demanded closure. The blip gave him time. Time gave him knowledge, and knowledge gave him certainty. From the Ancient One's explanation to Strange's sacrifice, from Steve's quiet goodbye to his own silent snap, it all aligns. I don't see coincidence, I see design. Tony knew the cost of surviving was greater than the cost of dying. He chose the cheaper option for the universe, even though it was the most expensive one for him. This isn't martyrdom, it's optimization. Tony Stark becomes the ultimate constant, a sacrifice that stabilizes infinite variables. He didn't hope for a better tomorrow, he engineered it. And once it was built, he stepped away. That's why his death feels complete. There's nothing left unresolved in his arc. Tony read the final page and closed the book. The rest of the characters are still reading, and we're just catching up. That realization redefines Iron Man forever. Not as a hero who lost, but as one who finished the story before anyone else realized it. Tony Stark knew everything, and that knowledge changed the universe permanently, by design alone. So when people say Tony Stark is gone, I don't fully agree with them. He didn't vanish, he concluded. Tony didn't die in confusion, he died with comprehension. He wasn't guessing, he was confirming. That's why his story lingers, because certainty leaves an echo. In a universe obsessed with chaos, Tony chose understanding. He looked at infinity and blinked first. Not out of fear, but acceptance. I think that's the most human thing he ever did. Tony Stark didn't just save everyone, he trusted them. He trusted that the heroes who remain will rise. He trusted that the multiverse could survive without him guiding every outcome. And that trust is the final piece of his legacy. Tony didn't need to live to win. He just needed to know when to stop. That's wisdom earned through pain and genius combined. I believe Tony Stark became bigger than Iron Man. He became the answer to the question nobody else was asking. What do you do when you already know the ending? Tony answered it with his life, and the universe listened. That's why his silence speaks, louder than any explosion. Tony Stark knew everything, and he let go anyway. That's not defeat. It's the most complete victory imaginable, in every timeline. When I step back and look at Tony Stark's journey through this lens, his death stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like authorship. He wasn't written out of the story, he wrote himself out. Tony read ahead, understood the consequences, and chose the only ending that let everyone else keep going. I don't think Marvel needs to bring him back to honor that, because his absence is the proof. Every multiversal threat, every impossible choice carries the fingerprint of his logic. Tony Stark didn't just build armor, he built an ending strong enough to hold infinity. And that's why his story still feels alive. Not because he might return, but because his choice keeps echoing forward. I think Tony Stark knew everything, and knowing everything allowed him to finally rest. He didn't disappear, he concluded the equation. The universe didn't lose a hero, it gained stability. And stability is the rarest victory of all. Tony's behavior feels less emotional and more analytical, and I think that's because he saw too much. When he ran those simulations, they weren't just battle outcomes. They were timelines collapsing, merging, and rebirthing. Thousands of branches, each with a cost. Doctor Strange experienced time like a vision, but Tony experienced it like data. Strange saw what would happen. Tony understood why it had to happen. That difference matters. Science doesn't accept miracles without equations, and Tony built equations for destiny. I imagine him watching futures where he survives, only to see the multiverse fracture under the weight of his continued interference. Futures where he wins louder, smarter, stronger, and still loses everything that matters. That kind of knowledge doesn't turn you fearless, it turns you precise. I started to see Tony less as Iron Man and more as a man carrying unbearable information, pretending everything was normal so no one else had to carry it with him. And that silent burden explains every restrained smile, every pause, every moment he chose not to speak, because knowledge, unchecked, can destroy heroes faster than any villain ever could in worlds where truth arrives too early for anyone involved there. That brings me to something even darker that Tony would never say out loud. While the world focused on alien invasions and stones, Tony's systems were scanning deeper patterns. Cosmic anomalies, mystical spikes, impossible overlaps between science and magic. I believe Friday, or a hidden successor AI, was tracking these signals quietly. And one region kept lighting up, Latveria. Buried in fragmented intelligence reports was a name that never went public, never became a headline, yet kept repeating. Victor Von Doom. Tony knew what that combination meant. A man who could bend physics and belief at the same time would always outgrow brute force solutions. I think Tony realized Doom wasn't just a future enemy, he was a necessary imbalance. An evil that forces reality to adapt. That's why Tony never tried to confront him early. You don't eliminate a storm forming on the horizon. You study its patterns and prepare shelters. Doom represented a threat bigger than Thanos, not because of power but because of intention. Tony understood that some villains are symptoms, not causes, and removing them too soon destabilizes everything, especially when destiny itself is under observation by minds far more patient than heroes ever are alone. I think the most heartbreaking realization is that Tony didn't stumble into his death. He selected it. When I look at his final moments, I don't see panic or surprise. I see resolve. Tony understood that if he stayed alive, the multiverse would continue bending around him, reacting to his presence like a stress point that never healed. But if he died, the Avengers would shatter emotionally and then evolve. Loss would force growth. His death becomes a catalyst, not an ending. A painful instruction written into reality itself. Sometimes saving the world isn't about surviving the explosion. It's about becoming the spark that forces everyone else to move forward. Tony's sacrifice creates space for new leaders, new mistakes, and new choices without his shadow hovering over them. I realized Tony wasn't thinking like a soldier in that moment. He was thinking like a father leaving behind rules, boundaries, and warnings. He chose absence as his final tool, knowing it would hurt, knowing it would work. That choice reframes Endgame as an act of design, not desperation or last-minute bravery, because Tony never left anything unplanned, especially when the universe itself was the project he couldn't abandon halfway through. This is where Avengers Doomsday starts to feel less like a movie title and more like a confession. I believe it's Tony's hidden protocol, buried deep inside Stark tech, waiting for the worst possible moment. A Stark AI designed not to fight but to guide. It activates only when the multiverse begins collapsing, when Dr. Doom approaches God-level power, and when heroes are divided beyond repair. That specificity doesn't feel accidental. This AI would already understand Reed Richards' predicted behavior, Doom's decision patterns, and the emotional weaknesses of every Avenger left behind. The team wouldn't be making choices freely anymore. They'd be walking through corridors Tony already mapped. Not because he wanted control, but because chaos without direction destroys worlds. I imagine this AI speaking calmly, without ego, reminding them that the plan only works if they trust it. In that scenario, the Avengers aren't soldiers. They're participants inside Tony's final experiment. A test designed to prove whether heroes can follow logic even when emotion screams louder, because the fate of everything depends on discipline over instinct and trust in a man who planned beyond his lifetime without asking for gratitude or recognition from anyone, still watching silently from afar. By the time Secret Wars arrives, Tony Stark wouldn't need to be physically present. His logic would be everywhere. I think Battleworld itself was something Tony simulated decades earlier, a stitched reality born from collapse. Heroes versus variants isn't chaos, it's a stress test. Tony warned that when universes collide, people don't fight monsters, they fight themselves. Every variant reflects a choice that could have been made differently. The real question isn't who wins, but what survives. I imagine Tony leaving behind one final dilemma, knowing exactly how heroes operate. Save one universe or save the multiverse. Heroes will always choose wrong, but for the right reasons. And Tony accounted for that. He knew morality would sabotage efficiency, and he designed the plan around that flaw. That's the genius and the tragedy. Tony didn't believe in perfect heroes. He believed in predictable ones. And predictability, when understood deeply enough, becomes the strongest weapon of all. It's chilling to realize the endgame wasn't a battle, but a behavioral equation, solved long before anyone knew the variables existed. Tony didn't predict outcomes. He predicted people, and people are always consistent under pressure, especially heroes wearing masks and carrying impossible expectations alone together. When I step back and look at the entire saga through this lens, Tony Stark stops being a character and becomes a constant. A man quietly adjusting the board while everyone else argues over pieces. His silence after Endgame isn't absence, it's intention. Every hero who rises, every mistake repeated, every war escalated follows probabilities Tony already measured. That doesn't make him a puppet master. It makes him a realist. He knew telling the Avengers everything would turn them into soldiers following orders, not heroes choosing sacrifice. Information changes people. Too much certainty kills courage. Tony protected their humanity by keeping them in the dark. That's why his plans feel cruel. They had to. Growth requires uncertainty. I think that's the hardest truth to accept. Tony didn't trust heroes with the full picture because he trusted them to do the right thing without it. And somehow that faith is his most heroic act. Not the snap, not the suit, but restraint in the face of godlike knowledge. Because power shared too freely always corrupts intention. Tony understood that better than anyone, having lived as both hero and weapon in worlds that kept burning until someone stepped aside for everyone else. Dr. Doom's rise, then, isn't a failure of the Avengers. It's part of the design. Tony knew that ultimate order only emerges when chaos reaches its peak. Doom isn't meant to be defeated early. He's meant to force convergence. Science and magic, logic and belief, colliding until something new forms. That's why Doom becomes dangerous only after Tony is gone. Their coexistence would have broken the balance. Two men who see too much cannot share the same timeline. Tony stepping away allows Doom to step forward, pushing reality toward its breaking point. And only at that point can Secret Wars happen. I think Tony accepted that some worlds need to burn so others can be rewritten. That's a brutal idea. But Tony was never gentle with truth. He just delayed it. Doom is the storm Tony predicted, and the Avengers are the survivors Tony prepared. Whether they realize it or not, they're still moving inside his shadow. A shadow shaped like sacrifice, foresight, and impossible responsibility, carried quietly by a man who refused to be worshipped because gods make poor guardians, and Tony never wanted that title, even when he earned it, again and again, across broken timelines without applause. So when Avengers Doomsday finally unfolds, I don't think we'll be watching heroes improvising. We'll be watching them unknowingly execute Tony's final logic. Every alliance, every betrayal, every sacrifice slotting into a framework he left behind. That realization makes the story tragic and beautiful at the same time. Tony trusted the Avengers enough to let them believe they were choosing freely, even as the road narrowed around them. Free will within boundaries. Choice within inevitability. That's the kind of system only someone obsessed with control would design, and only someone who learned to let go could finish. I think the Avengers will curse Tony's name when they realize how much he withheld. And then they'll understand why. Because knowing everything too early would have broken them. Tony didn't save the world by living. He saved it by leaving instructions written in pain. Instructions disguised as loss, silence, and unanswered questions so heroes could grow into something stronger than obedience, something capable of surviving the truth, because survival, not victory, was always the goal, across infinite collapsing realities. Tony planned for endurance, not glory. And that difference changes everything when the final war arrives, without him standing there, watching quietly somewhere. This is why I believe Tony Stark knew everything, but chose to tell almost nothing. Because heroes burdened with certainty stop being heroes. They become weapons. Tony refused to turn his friends into tools, even if it meant becoming the villain in their memories. He carried the knowledge alone, trusted the math, and walked into death knowing the story wouldn't end with him. If the Avengers survive Doomsday and Secret Wars, it won't be because they were stronger than Doom. It will be because Tony already accepted they wouldn't be. He planned for failure, adaptation, and moral compromise. In the end, Tony's greatest invention wasn't the suit, the AI, or time travel. It was restraint. The courage to step away and let the universe struggle without him. That's not a superhero ending. It's something far more human. A man who saves everyone by trusting them to fail first and learn from the ruins he predicted. That's the quiet brilliance hiding in plain sight, and the reason his absence feels so heavy, because it was always intentional, long before the snap ever happened. Tony saw the ending coming and stepped aside anyway, for the universe to continue without his guidance openly. And maybe that's the real reason Tony Stark still feels present in every future conflict. Not as a ghost, but as a framework. Every choice echoes his logic. Every sacrifice mirrors his final one. I think that's why his story doesn't feel finished, even without resurrection or variants. Tony became an idea, and ideas don't die. They influence. As Avengers face doom and the collapse of realities, they aren't just fighting enemies. They're wrestling with the consequences of knowledge Tony chose not to share. That tension, that struggle between freedom and fate, is the true legacy he left behind. Not instructions carved in stone, but questions etched into every decision. What would Tony do? And more importantly, why wouldn't he do it himself? The answers matter more than the battles. Because in the end, the multiverse isn't saved by strength. It's saved by understanding. Understanding shaped by sacrifice, restraint, and impossible foresight, qualities Tony mastered at the highest cost, long before anyone noticed him stepping back, because the loudest heroes rarely plan quietly. Tony did both, and paid the price willingly, so others could keep choosing, even when choices hurt more than certainty ever would in the long run alone. So when you watch Avengers Doomsday and Secret Wars unfold, I want you to look past the explosions and listen for the silence Tony left behind. That silence is where the plan lives. Not in commands, but in patterns. Not in control, but in trust. Tony Stark wasn't trying to win forever. He was trying to give the universe a chance to survive itself. And if this theory holds, then every loss, every betrayal, every impossible choice is part of a map drawn by someone who loved humanity enough to step away from it. I think that makes his story even more powerful than a resurrection ever could. It reframes Iron Man not as a martyr frozen in time, but as a designer of endings. Someone who understood that stories don't conclude when the hero wins, but when others are forced to continue without guidance. Tony built a future that could exist without him, and that may be the rarest form of genius in any universe. He didn't want monuments or praise. He wanted continuity. A world messy enough to grow, flawed enough to fight, and uncertain enough to matter. That's why his absence hurts, and why it works. Because real protection isn't about standing in front of danger forever. It's about teaching the world how to stand when you're gone. And that lesson echoes louder than any repulsor blast ever could across timelines, long after the armor stops flying and the man becomes memory, shaping choices from the background exactly as he intended, quietly, patiently, forever. Until the next story begins somewhere beyond our sight, still watching on. If this breakdown made you see the MCU a little differently, pass it along, hit like, share it with someone who still misses Tony, and subscribe for more theories like this.